Well, there's a second parameter associated with the Earth. Earth has what the ancients called a heartbeat. We now know that for every 1 second of our experience, the 1 second that we just had, Earth pulsed a certain number of times. And you might say, well, I didn't feel that pulse. What researchers say is that we all feel it, and we're so used to it that we average it out into our experience. It's sort of like the heartbeat. If you place your ear next to the chest of a person, you hear a mechanical heartbeat, and in addition to that, there is an electromagnetic pulse that you do not maybe hear or feel. And it's that pulse that we're talking about on Earth. It's not a mechanical pulse, it's an electromagnetic pulse. We measured it for the first time in 1898. And that pulse was measured at 7.8 beats per second, or 7.8 cycles per second, 7.8 hertz. Well, we believed that this pulse was a constant all through the early 1900s. It didn't change. It was 7.8 cycles per second, 7.8 beats. All through World War I, World War II, up through the Korean War. In 1958, there was a meeting, one of the first meetings where all the nations came together under the guise of scientific research. And this pulse was the topic of study. This was called the IGY, the International Geophysical Year. And the pulse that we believed was the constant became the basis for many new communications and weapon systems at that time. And there was an agreement to cease publishing this information in the open literature. So from 1958 on, you see very little of this base pulse, this base resonant frequency of the Earth. And it still remained a constant, about 7.8 hertz. Well, it wasn't long after that, in the mid-1980s, something began to change with this pulse. It began to increase. And it went from 7.8 to 8, 8.23 to 8.6 to 9. Now some researchers are reporting measurements over 9, and it appears that this pulse is increasing. It's very controversial because of the way the measurements are being taken. Different organizations are receiving different measurements, and they're all pretty much in agreement something has changed. So if for no other reason, these two parameters alone, we can digitally validate that there is something unique happening in Earth right now. The magnetics are decreasing, this pulse is changing, and they appear to be converging upon a point in history. It may be for the first time that through frequency and magnetics, we have the ability to digitally track the parameters that are leading us to what the ancients called the shift of the ages. When the magnetics fall to zero, and when this pulse reaches a threshold resonance around 13 hertz, 13 cycles per second, 13 beats. For many researchers now, they believe that marks the time that we actually begin the shift that was referenced in the Egyptian traditions and the Mayan calendars and many of the indigenous prophecies. One of the reasons all of these phenomena are a mystery to the West is because we don't really have a framework within which to place this kind of information. We don't have the context. 1700 years ago, key elements of our ancient heritage were lost. They were relegated to the esoteric traditions of mystery schools and sacred orders. At least 25 books were taken from what was later to become our biblical texts by a recommendation from the Council of Nicaea in the 4th century. The implications of this act, this point in time, are vast. At very best, our view of our world, our interpretation of history, and our potential role in our world is incomplete without these texts to provide that context. And I ask the question often now, bearing this in mind, is it possible that the very basis of our society and our culture, our language, our science, technology, our religious traditions, even the way we love one another in our interpersonal relationships, is it possible that they're based on an incomplete understanding of our most sacred heritage and our most sacred history? There are many researchers and scholars now that believe the answer to this is yes. So we consider this possibility. Up until 1700 years ago, we were much clearer of our role in history. and our relationship to the creative forces of our world and the cosmos. And it's interesting because as we witness our lives and our history today, even through the incomplete context and framework we've built this culture and this society and the language and the science and the religion, and it has worked very well. It's served us and it's pushed us onto a path that has led us to this point in this moment. So the changing of these texts, I believe it transcends being good, bad, right, or wrong. It simply was a path, and we're now living the outcome of that path. It brought us to the point where we are today, and now we're inviting this information back into our culture, into our memory, into our science, in the hopes of building an even more complete understanding of our world and our relationship to our world, and from that to pivot forward into this new experience that we call the new millennium. So the original wisdom of these traditions is what we'll address for the next portion of our program here. Unfortunately, these texts are not contained in a single, concise, neat volume in one place where we can say, this is where you go to find this information. It is strewn through cultures and interpretations and translations ranging from the Dead Sea Scrolls to the Nag Hammadi library of Gnostic texts. And the story behind the discovery is actually very interesting. There was a young boy that was out looking for firewood, which is scarce and in short supply in Egypt. And he came upon a tomb. And in the tomb was a library of documents. Some of them were actually books. He began taking those back to his house and used them as kindling for months until some of these documents made it into the Cairo Museum, and they were excavated, recovered in what we now call the Nag Hammadi Library. In the Qumran area, in the Dead Sea, another discovery was made inside of earthen vessels secured in caves above sea level. These became known as the Dead Sea Scrolls and are attributed now to a group of communities that we now call the Essenes, Essenes. We first see evidence of these Essenes about 500 years before the birth of Christ, 2,500 years ago. And what we find are references in the ancient literature, in the Roman and the Egyptian literature, of these communities that developed around individuals who chose to live very close to the earth, be self-sufficient, and honor the cycles and the rhythms and the creative forces as they perceive them in their world. They couldn't do that living in the cities of that time, so they chose to create their own communities where they could honor these traditions. And from their own accounts, the traditions of the Essenes came from even earlier traditions with their roots in Egypt, which came from earlier traditions of a civilization that predates Egypt now. So we find the elements and the threads of the Essene traditions back as far as Babylonia and Sumeria. So it appears there was this common wisdom, this knowledge that's been with us for a long time, up to the time 2,500 years ago where the Essenes settled in the Dead Sea in the Qumran area. They were also meticulous record keepers, and for that reason we are now understanding more about them as we're recovering their texts. After the time of Christ, the Essenes dispersed from their focus communities, and we now have records that they scattered across the face of the earth. We find records of the Essene communities moving into the jungles of Bolivia and Peru and South America, into the Himalayan highlands in Nepal, Tibet, into India. And now recent records are even showing they came and walked the Americas, both North and South America. And Native American, North and South American traditions actually speak of, reference, and identify Essene traditions as being the roots of many of the native concepts of compassion and peace and forgiveness and blessing. There are these common threads. It's very interesting because if the research bears out this common thread between and among all these traditions, there's a possibility that we've all been speaking from the same page of the same book, interpreted in different ways for over 2,000 years now. And the implications of that are vast as well. If we could go back into those texts that were taken 1700 years ago, and there are people that have done this, the texts taken out by the council were stored in the vaults of the Vatican Library. And there was at least one gentleman in the early part of the 1900s that was given access to those vaults and was able to transcribe many of those traditions. His name was Edmund Bordeaux-Zekli, or some people pronounce him Zek. Edmund Bordeaux-Zekli translated those and brought the Essene Gospels forward into the 20th century. In addition to many of the other translations, the Coptic Greek, the Egyptian, the Ethiopian translations, they all carry these common threads of information. If we could go back and summarize the common threads that are important to us today, what we see in the 20th century idiom are a series of tenets, 4 tenets. 2 of these we'll address in greater depth. One of these tenets says that we are unity by nature. It puts forth the idea that although there are many, many physical bodies walking this world, there's a single consciousness that's here, and every choice made by every individual in every moment of every life contributes to the collective nature of that consciousness. The second tenet reminds us that we're moving collectively toward this rare moment in human as well as earth history. The ancients called the shift of the ages, and that's what we've been speaking about, all of the phenomenon appearing to converge at this time in history. The third tenet reminds us that we have now and have always had what today we call an inner technology that allows us direct access to the creative forces of our world. We've always had a communion, a relationship directly with the creative forces of our world. 1700 years ago, we began to feel separate from our world and forget that. And the fourth tenet reminds us that the most ancient science, today we call compassion. Compassion is our opportunity to transcend the great challenges of life and history with grace. Here we are barreling down this road, and as the parameters, the geophysical parameters, converge on this time in history, our life parameters are converging as well. Many people, as I travel the world today, they sense that we are being challenged to levels beyond any level that we've ever been challenged before in our personal lives, in our emotional lives. In that space, they find their greatest strengths, and they find their deepest loves and their greatest levels of compassion. And the ancients remind us through this fourth tenet that compassion is this most ancient science that allows us to transcend the great challenges. It's not that we're changing what happened, it's we're reconciling within our bodies what it means to us to transcend the great challenge, the personal challenges that occur in our individual lives that collectively become the global challenges. Compassion allows us to transcend these with grace. In these traditions, the Essene traditions, as well as many indigenous calendars, texts, and prophecies, we're reminded that history points to now. For thousands of generations, there's been an expectation that something big is about to occur in our world, and we're measuring that now, as well as within our bodies, and we're measuring that as well. Almost universally, ancient texts, codices, indigenous prophecies, verbal accounts all remind us that all previous lifetimes point to this time in history, that we're given the benefit of thousands of generations of collective experience as our foundation from which to pivot forward into something brand new. That through our time in this world, in the presence of one another, and this is key, the Essenes actually put forth the idea that every human living on the surface of the earth, by virtue of being in this world, is an initiate of the highest order. By being in this world, we're invited to demonstrate the highest levels of mastery, and we do it in the presence of one another. Rather than isolating ourselves from the challenges of this world, it's by plunging ourselves into the greatest challenges that we find our greatest strengths, and we're reminded of our